Hello, we are back with another edition of the Korea Pod. My name is Henry Shin. As always, a reminder, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcast or wherever you see podcasts. It does help to get word out, and we always appreciate the support. So let's talk about these political gaffes that have been going on in the political world among politicians who have stuck their foot in the mouth. This is something that is somewhat of a common occurrence. As you know, politicians in the public spotlight, they will often say things that they later regret. That's just human nature. We all say things that perhaps we'd like to take back, but because politicians are so much in the public eye, they're always trying to garner support, to get some kind of help for their constituencies, maybe advance some kind of political agenda or ideology. You'll often see mistakes being made. This one, though, is particularly egregious. We're talking about the Conservative Party. If you've listened to my past podcast, you'll recall one of the podcasts I did where the main conservative opposition party, the Liberty Korea Party, had been mired in these series of, in Korean, makmal, or really, really harsh, inflammatory rhetoric that didn't do anything to advance their cause or enhance their popularity, and in fact backlashed against them spectacularly, especially in the lead up to the June local elections, which resulted in a huge wipeout, a blowout, them losing almost all of the seats up for grabs in those local elections. And so you had this sense that the Liberty Korea Party had to regroup. They were in an existential crisis. They had to form an emergency committee. They hired Kim Byung-jun to head this committee, and they're trying to remake themselves into a party that can once again regain the trust of the party. It's been slow going. It's been a rough and rocky process, and I think the jury's still out on how they are going to be able to garner support. But right now, they were in a position, they still are, quite frankly, in a position that they can capitalize on some of the missteps with the current government and the current ruling party, which has seen a little bit of an ebb, a downturn in the president's popularity. Moon Jae-in's approval ratings mired now in the 50%, which is still pretty high, relatively speaking, if you look back in the past, but much lower than his previous highs of close to 80% in certain polls, especially in the aftermath of all of that inter-Korean reconciliation and the summits and all of those things, which brought about a lot of positive coverage for the president. So recently, most of the hits to the president and the ruling party's popularity right now is due to the economic malaise and some of the issues, especially with job creation, the idea that the economic conditions are not very good right now, especially for the working class, especially for the middle class, the people who basically are not in the top 1% of the population. So because of this nationwide perception, rightly or wrongly, that the economy isn't doing well, and this debate over the effectiveness of the current Moon administration's push for an income-led economic growth policy, meaning things like raising wages, making goods and services cheaper for people who can afford it more, giving them more disposable income, encouraging them to spend into the economy, creating more domestic demand, and really making the economy mature enough to not be so reliant on the chaebols and exports for economic growth. That is the very tough transition this current government is trying to undertake. It's meeting a lot of resistance from conservatives, from the conservative media, from the wealthy, the elites, the big corporations. So there is a big debate going on right now, and we're going to maybe talk about that in a separate podcast. But one aspect of that debate has been this idea of how you can create economic growth in this country. What's the long-term model? So the current Liberty Korea Party had a recent decision, and they decided that they were going to counter this income-led economic growth policy with a policy of their own. They've always been supportive of the past Park Chung-hee dictatorship, kind of industrial-led growth, which has been sort of kind of dominated by the chaebols, and having them sort of lead the way with lots of exports and hopefully trickling down into the economy, creating jobs. And during the 60s and 70s, some can argue that that actually was a very effective model. But people are saying in this day and age, in the year 2018, it is not an effective model anymore. But the conservatives, they recognize that this is an opportunity for them to exploit because the current government is losing popularity. So one way they decided to do this recently was with the resumption of the National Assembly. The current floor leader of the Liberty Korea Party, Kim Sung-tae, gave a speech. It was a very provocative speech. We won't go into the details of the other aspects of the speech, but he was very controversial. A lot of people criticized him for not being a well-mannered person in the way he was addressing his colleagues in the National Assembly as well as the nation, in how he was attacking the current government and the ruling party. But there was one aspect of the speech that really proved to be very controversial and might indeed have been the main sort of culprit as to why his speech was considered a failure. And in that address, he proposed a very dramatic proposal. What he said was the main sort of driver to grow this economy was to restore the nation's birth rate. So there were some recent statistics that came out that showed that the nation's birth rate for the first time fell below 1 per capita, meaning per family. So 0.96 is the figure. And you need, I believe the statistics say, 2.1 births per family to have a sustained population, meaning a population that will either break even or continue to grow. You have to be above that number. Korea's been below that number for quite a while. And so it is kind of careening towards this elderly or aged society, which of course is a big concern, a lot of implications for welfare policy and spending to take care of this growing elderly population going forward. But so I think there's this idea and consensus that the birth rate has to be raised. You need young people to be contributing to the economy, and you need more young people to continue to replace the ranks of the elderly people who retire. And to keep an economy productive, you need productive members of society to contribute to that economy. So how do you raise the birth rate if you believe that is the model for success? Well, this floor leader, LKP's Kim Sung-tae, said we need to raise the birth rate, and we're going to do this. This is going to be better than this stupid income-led economic growth policy, and we're going to do this by raising the birth rate. And how I'm going to do this, we're going to offer you an incentive. If you pop out a baby, if a family decides to have a baby, we're going to give them 100 million won for the duration of their lifetime. So it's a very generous offer, I guess, on the surface. You're going to get 100 million won, which is roughly equivalent to 100,000 US dollars, and that will be allotted to you. There's going to be a 20 million won payout initially after the birth of a child, and then subsequently monthly payments up until the child reaches adulthood, a few $100s a month until that total reaches 100 million won. So I imagine that the LKP policymakers and the political strategists thought this was a brilliant move. They were able to capitalize and exploit some of the disgruntled feelings regarding the current government's economic leadership and how the conditions seem to be stagnant or maybe even have deteriorated for some people in Korean society. So they said this is going to be a game changer. We can show that we're offering something bold. I'm sure they did not expect what ensued, which was a huge backlash. Right after Kim Sung-tae gave that speech, many politicians spoke out saying that this is ridiculous, especially the more progressive opposition party members like from the Justice Party. Obviously, the ruling Democratic Party said this was a stupid policy. And what they're basically arguing was that the nuance or the implication of Kim Sung-tae's address and this policy proposal was that they were trying to have women of Korean society be used as tools to basically be baby factories, pop out babies, to have these babies grow up and become contributing members to this country's economy, and they're going to coerce these women to pop out those babies by offering them, dangling this carrot of 100 million won. So a lot of people right away felt there were some sexist elements to that policy. And also there was this idea that this policy was outdated. It was sort of anachronistic in the past, where you felt that the only way to grow an economy was to just pump more members of society into that economy and coerce young people into having babies, saying that that was a patriotic thing to do. And it might be a hardship. It's difficult to raise kids in this day and age, and you got to do it for the good of the country. Now, people will say that this is a very different time from the industrialization period of the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on, where the economy was growing at a rapid rate and people were mobilized. Obviously, it was not a democracy. It was a dictatorship. So you didn't really have a lot of choices and options in terms of what you wanted to do in life. But the situations have definitely changed. It's not that the economy overall is much worse than it was in the 60s. Obviously, that's not the case. This is a modern and overall developed economy, a member of the OECD. But for the economic polarization, there certainly is a big problem. The rich seem to keep getting richer. The poor seem to be getting poorer, and the middle class seems to be getting squeezed. And it's especially difficult for young people to even consider having a baby. There are issues, and we'll maybe talk about this in future podcasts, with young people trying to have a job. You go to a 4-year college, you work hard to try to get good enough grades to get to a decent college, you study hard, and you prepare your resumes and your specs, and you try to get into one of the cushy positions, either as a government civil servant or as an employee for one of the chaebols, one of the big conglomerates. But those are very, very few and far between. It's like 100-to-1 ratio in most of these places to try to get one of these jobs. The competition, there's going to be 100, 200, 300 people vying for that one spot. And so what you have as a result is the vast majority of these young people, even after a 4-year college degree, and 80% of high school students here go to college, which is immensely high, even in comparison to other OECD nations. And most of them can't find those decent jobs. So the only jobs that might be available are from the SMEs, the small, medium-sized businesses. Those jobs offer far less pay, far fewer benefits. You can blame the SMEs for offering that kind of stingy salaries, but they are also just not in a competitive position to be able to recruit these people. They might be able to use the help, and they need employees, but they just simply can't afford to do it because it's a very non-competitive landscape when you're going up against the chaebols, who essentially have monopoly power in most of these industries and really engage in very unfair tactics in terms of driving out the competition from those SMEs. So that's a dilemma. Housing prices are high, especially in Seoul. Very difficult to be able to afford a house. And we'll talk about real estate and this craziness going on in a future podcast shortly. The issue of educational costs, private education costs are sky high. They continue to go up. So if you have a kid, worrying about just even giving that kid a decent education is just a huge, huge burden to have to think about. And so wages being stagnant, jobs not available, housing costs high, education costs sky high. How is a young person, a young married couple, a young person even considering to get married? How are they even going to conceive of having babies just for the sake of the nation's economic well-being? It's just not a reasonable thing to demand of people, especially kids. Well, not kids, but young people in their 20s and 30s and maybe beyond who have not decided to either get married or to have children. They're just not in a position to do so. And to demand that they do so is not reasonable. So that was a backlash after the address by Kim Sung-tae, the floor leader of the LKP. And then subsequently, another member of the LKP, a lawmaker by the name of Kim Ha-kyung, came out. There was a meeting of some sort of low birth rate committee in the National Assembly. There was a seminar. He spoke, and he basically said something along the lines that young people are selfish, and they do not recognize the value or the worth of doing something like raising a child for the good of the country. And he talked about how, our parents' generation, do you think it was easy for them to raise a kid? It was not easy to raise a kid, but they recognized the value of raising a kid, the good it does for the country. And so he's saying the young people have to recognize the value, the national good that can come about for raising a kid and making that sacrifice. Now, how do you think that would go over with the nation's young people, the people in their 20s and the 30s who consider this country to be hell chosen, who find it difficult enough to make ends meet, even to find a decent job, let alone think about getting married, let alone think about having a kid? It probably wouldn't go over very well. And so obviously towards Kim Ha-kyung, towards Kim Sung-tae, these LKP conservative lawmakers, the backlash has been fierce. It's been intense. And even within the LKP itself, there's been some dispute as to whether this is official policy. The emergency committee chairman, the guy who's sort of the caretaker leader of the party right now, Kim Byung-jun, he said, well, this is an official policy. Other lawmakers are saying, well, it is because Kim Sung-tae is the floor leader and he's the de facto leader of the party. So if he says it's a policy, it is the de facto official policy. I probably would advise him to think twice about having this, pushing forward with this really aggressively, because there's been some recent polling coming out about how people feel about this policy. And by a 2-to-1 margin, people are opposed to what the LKP is proposing. 100 million won payout in cash to somebody who pops out a baby, just to, I don't know. It sounds like a bribe. It sounds coercive, and it's not really appreciated, because most people who feel that the birth rate is a problem will say that there are various ways to incentivize it. How do you incentivize it is the question for debate. Now, a lot of people who support the current president and the current government and the current ruling party's plan, this push for income-led economic growth, will say you have to follow along that lines. And how do you do that? You look at Sweden, you look at Norway, these Scandinavian countries who have very generous welfare policies, who have relatively high taxation rates, but who also a much more developed economy. They were developed for a longer time before South Korea became a more developed economy. And they also, like all developed countries, as the economy grew and developed, they saw their populations have their birth rates decline quite dramatically. That happens across the board to all countries as they develop into advanced nation status. And so Sweden, Norway, it was the same thing, but they were able to raise their birth rates. In fact, I think Sweden is close to 1.9, 1.8 births per family, which is quite high, considering that they are a very advanced nation. And how did they pull it off? They didn't do it by offering these cash payments, these bribes to mothers who decide to pop out a baby. What they did was create the environment that made it more conducive to raise a family. That means paid parental leaves. That means universal childcare. It means universal education. It means welfare benefits for when someone gets laid off, or subsidizations for when you need to find a house and you need an affordable place to live. Those are conditions that allow a family, a prospective family, to decide to raise a kid. And quite frankly, those are not conditions that are being met in Korea right now, and it does not appear that is going to be happening anytime soon unless the social welfare policy of this country dramatically changes. But notice, providing that environment, affordable housing, affordable childcare, affordable work benefits, more equal benefits and pay for women to be encouraged to have a career and have a baby at the same time, not having it to be mutually exclusive, a binary choice between two things like it is here in Korea. That is something that is more difficult. It takes a longer time and it takes tougher policy decisions. And it's a lot easier than just saying, I'm going to give you 100 million won if you pop out a baby. And so for the Liberty Korea Party, a lot of people say you guys are being hypocritical. You guys have been opposed to any of those proposed welfare expansions like universal childcare, like providing more generous parental leave options for workers, to provide more affordable housing options for young families. You guys have been across the board pretty much universally opposed to those expansions of welfare policy, and yet here you're trying to offer these huge cash payouts just to advance this political agenda of what you think is going to be exploiting this downturn in the or perceived downturn in the economy to try and capitalize on a lull in support for the current government and ruling party. So it's a cynical ploy, and it might have been a brilliant political strategy if they had exploited this situation in the right way. However, it feels like it's a lost opportunity. And if you are a supporter of the LKP, you're going to think this was really a very, very crucial mistake that you hope, if you're supporting the LKP, that they'll be able to get back. But I'm not sure if they can get back because they've now changed the conversation a bit. People have been saying, do we need to continue this income-led economic growth policy? And that was going to be the debate going forward. Now everyone's focused, or a lot of people are focused on, why is the LKP so inherently anachronistic, cynical, hypocritical, and what is this ridiculous policy that they're offering with trying to coerce the nation's women into popping out babies like there's some kind of baby factory, and not recognizing the value of human work and addressing the real issues of why young people feel this country is aptly named Hell Chosen. And those are questions that obviously this current political landscape is going to be wrestling with, and it's a political faux pas, a political gaffe that the LKP will have to try to recover from. And I can tell you right now, despite the downturn in popularity for the president and the ruling party, the LKP did itself no good favors here with this widely perceived to be ridiculous child birth rate boosting proposal. All right, that's going to do it for us. We'll be back with another edition of the Korea Pod. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. My name is Henry Shin. Goodbye.